Now it's time for our weekly energy update with Dan McTeague, President of Canadians for Affordable Energy.
Hi, Teresa. It's good to be here again. We are now past the midpoint in February. A lot of people are reading week, a lot of snow across the country. A lot of things have happened in the past week or so geopolitically that have had an influence on what we're doing, what we're paying here at home. But of course, one of the things to note is gasoline prices really haven't moved much this week, nor has diesel. This is a little interesting because I think I'm getting a lot of calls from people saying, especially here in Toronto, for instance, in the GTA, hey, you know what? The needle hasn't moved at all, except for gas stations who usually in the morning have one price and in the evening is down 7 or 8 cents a liter. That's what I call gas, I've used that expression, gas bar shenanigans. And that's the gas stations have control over 7 or 8 cents a liter. That's it, except in Maritimes where they have a regulated market. But what we're dealing with here is a stagnating market where Canadian dollar remains where it is. We're sort of in a holding pattern. We know that inventories for oil has built up a little bit, as has gasoline, because of the cold weather. Not many people are driving, but they are using more diesel, not just for jets, not just for snow plows, obviously, but this time of year for home heating fuel, which is derived from diesel. It's interesting to point out that diesel, of course, isn't very well made in the United States without crude coming from Canada. It takes a heavier, denser form of oil to make diesel. The United States produces a drill, baby drill, lots of gas and natural gas, but that oil that comes out of fracked wells in the United States produces only gasoline because of the properties that are involved. So anybody who thinks that Canadian oil isn't necessary, especially in the United States, only has to look at the fact that without Canada, given that Venezuela can't do it, Mexico can't do it, we don't want Russian oil, and we certainly don't want Iranian oil. Canada remains really the only country that can really help the United States and maintain that energy security that it so desperately needs. Notwithstanding some of the ignorance of our premiers and even, yes, the President Donald Trump saying they can make all the oil they want. Oil has its own properties, its own qualities. And unfortunately for Americans, they don't have the stuff we have that they desperately need. So that aside, we're going to see a continuation, I think, this week of rather indifferent price signals. We could see a bit of balance here and there with oil going down, maybe $1 or $2 a barrel, but gasoline futures going up a little bit. And of course, as we get closer to whether or not there will be a reimposition or whether or not we'll continue to have a stay in terms of tariffs, it's going to have an effect on the Canadian dollar, which is currently trading at about 141 pennies, 142 pennies to buy a US dollar. If we don't get tariffs as was prescribed originally by the Trump administration, Trump himself, then I think we can continue to see the Canadian dollar strengthen. If it goes the other way, and there are in fact not just lumber tariffs, and as we know, steel and aluminum tariffs, but also tariffs generally, then we can see the Canadian dollar fall. If it falls to say 150 pennies to buy one US dollar, then that would increase gas prices very shortly in the range of about 5 to 6 cents a liter. If they stay where they are, they move down a little bit. That could be very helpful in terms of bringing gas prices. By the way, any way you look at it, 133 pennies bought you a US dollar last year. Now it's 142. So yes, there has been a decline in the value of the Canadian dollar. That's because we're not selling enough resources to the rest of the world. And this idea that somehow, Canada's not a great place to invest under the current negative climate isn't going to help. So Teresa, a lot of things, a lot of moving parts when it comes to doing gas pricing. I've showed this many times. This just gives you an example of what has to go into every calculation every day that I've been doing for the past 25, 30 years. When I invented predicting gas prices and saved Canadians a lot of money. Much of that, of course, taken for granted now. But over time, every year you save $500-600. It's a rather useful way of trying to present to people where we're going to go. So this week, I'm not predicting a whole lot of gasoline. We'll stay at $1.84, 85, 86 in Vancouver, 5 cents less than that in Victoria. We'll see the rest of interior BC in the 168, 169 range, while Alberta holds off at 138 to 142. And of course, Saskatchewan rarely moving 149. With Manitoba now restoring the provincial sales tax somewhere in the vicinity of about $1.55, $1.56. In Ontario, $1.56 as well. Now for Quebec, always 12 cents a liter more. You're looking at $1.66 to $1.68, while the Maritimes, well, they're going to look for a bit of an increase next week because they didn't really get much this week. Probably about 2 cents a liter for both diesel and gasoline, but it really depends on the number of factors, and we'll have to see what happens over the next several days because they calculate an average gas price on a week. And by the way, it's not a great system because when prices fall everywhere, you know within 2 days you're going to get a gas price decrease. There in Atlantic Canada, unless it's a massive decrease, you don't really get the benefit of a decrease for a full week. And even when they go up, although you're held back a little bit, it's really hard on retailers to absorb higher costs that they have to abide by, that is the market price, while the bureaucrats decide when to implement an increase. However you frame it, having bureaucrats decide what gasoline prices is a very ridiculous idea, and they can't do directly that which they can't do indirectly. And so, for that reason, trying to come up with models that somehow synthesize or replicate the open market, knowing full well that transparency is the best way to approach this with predictability that's come in over the past 20 years or so. A lot of these models and regulation served a political need that once existed long before the internet, long before, of course, there was transparency in public numbers. So for all these reasons, I think we need to look very carefully at how we price energy in this country, because one thing's very clear: energy prices affect the cost of everything. And you don't take my word for it. Last week, Teresa, we saw the inflation rate move up a little bit, driven by gasoline. And that was driven by two factors: carbon taxes up 4 cents a liter, and the value of the Canadian dollar having another 5 or 6 cent a liter value. So anybody who thinks that energy prices aren't that valuable isn't really paying attention. And we need to look at not only its effect, its cascading effect through the economy and the cost of heating, cost of transportation, which affects the cost of pretty much everything else, but also ultimately even the interest rates we pay for, because inflation is going to be the guide by which governments look at, the Bank of Canada looks at interest rates. Then, of course, you want to make sure that you have stable gas prices, or gas prices moving down, because they can creep up on you very quickly. I'll end this way. The more that governments and politicians try to add to the price of energy and find ways to make energy availability, reliability, and frustrate those things, the higher the price for Canadians. And I think this is something where Canadians have reached a point. Affordability is the number one issue in Canada. It is not about climate. It's not about, trendy green net zero policy. So we need to look very carefully at policies that put Canadians first and maintain our standard of living by developing and allowing Canadians access to our energy sector as well as the world.